It's interesting, over the years, they've had conceptualization, they've had guidelines, they've had plans, and so on. This time they actually call them transformation. And I think that this is actually a very big moment in Cuba.
Hello everybody, here is another episode of Sustainable LatAm, and we are looking at a massively interesting and complicated issue today, which is Cuba. With me I've got Alberto Souviron, a Bolivian journalist, Latin American specialist and digital analyst. And our main guest, I should have started with her, is Emily Morris, a development economist from the University College London, UCL, who will be helping us trying to answer some of the questions about Cuba. And we will be joined in a little while by Julian Seydoux, economic analyst, who is also looking at Latin American capital markets in some detail. So, having very briefly introduced us in this manner, I think we should jump straight in. And I have an initial question for Emily, which is simply, how big is the crisis and the government's response in Cuba? And by how big, I sort of go a little bit behind that. There's this notion that there was a Cuban model of revolutionary socialism that has fascinated the Latin American left for more than 60 years. And my blunt question to Emily, perhaps, is, has it ended? Is it over?
Okay, well, that's some very big questions to start with. Thank you very much for inviting me. First of all, just the first half of your question, the crisis is huge. We know it's huge, that the power's been cut off. There's very little transport. A lot of, economic activity has come to a halt. It's just about as big as it could be, the crisis. The measures, the cutting off of the oil, combined with the other measures that the US has taken to try to, discourage or prevent other organizations, other businesses from dealing with Cuba, is creating a huge problem, and people are suffering. And we know that the vulnerable people are particularly suffering. Hello, Julian. So the second part of your question was, how big is the latest announcement of a package of measures that the Cuban government is taking? It's interesting, over the years they've had conceptualization, they've had guidelines, they've had plans, and so on. This time they actually call them transformation. And I think that this is actually a very big moment in Cuba. The government has said 3/4 of the measures listed were already on the cards. And I do think this is, to a large extent, the continuation of a process of reform that was in the pipeline. But there's a big difference here. One is the vocabulary used, because they're talking now about changing their system of economic management. They actually say they're changing from a system of physical planning to financial planning, and the state is withdrawing from management of businesses that can't make a profit or continue to make losses will be closed. They can make their own decisions, and it's become very clear, and it's spelt out in this document. So I think that this is a very big moment. The other thing that's happening is there's very clear move towards privatizing a lot of state assets. So there's a valuation of the state assets going on. Foreign investors, Cuban investors, Cuban Americans will be able to buy shares or buy companies in Cuba. All of that is laid out here. So then the third part of your question, to very briefly, we could discuss this. Is this the end of the Cuban model? It is at the end of the model that they developed when they were part of the Soviet bloc. It's the end of that model. Is that the end of the Cuban model altogether? I'd say that there's a process of, as they say, transformation. It is a transition, actually. to a market economy, to a mixed economy. But what they're trying to do is trying to retain control of the process so that the government still controls the strategic industries. It still aims to collect sufficient tax revenue to have free education, free health, a welfare system, and so on. So they're trying to rescue their model by transforming it. I think, if you see what I mean, it starts from the Cuban side. I think from the other side, I mean, the way that the transformation document has been received from the US side, they say it's no change. I don't think that's true. I think this is a real change. That, you know, the Cuban government has essentially declared that it is now radically opening to foreign investors. Big question is how much of this is actually going to happen, because this is a statement of intent. We have some initial indications. So the institution that's going to do the valuation of state assets ready for sale has been constituted. People who have registered to start their own businesses, there was a big, long waiting list. And now the government's issuing approvals at a colossal rate. So there has been a step up in the pace and depth of implementation. But, they do state that they reserve the right to monitor the process, to review. That's what they've been doing ever since, 1990, this kind of process of review and monitoring, which in a sense is what's been holding it up. Interesting that the older generation has really withdrawn now. So Raul Castro wasn't even in the discussions at the National Assembly. He's kind of withdrawn. He signed off on it. He gave his approval, but it wasn't his in any way. This is a project that's been led by Díaz-Canel with his generation of economic managers and economists and so on. So, yeah, I think it's big. But, yeah.
Emily.
Go ahead, Alberto.
Sorry, Andrew, yeah.
No, that's okay.
It's really interesting what we're saying, especially, yes, where we are seeing perhaps a big change. But it's really interesting that, as well, what you were saying a little bit earlier, that it says the Americans, especially, has replied to this with a lot of doubt, in a way, putting in doubt that anything is going to happen. Which, in a way, you have to ask yourselves, what are looking really the U.S. government in that area? We have to understand the new doctrine of the U.S. regarding Latin America and the way they are doing, and what they are really trying to obtain from Cuba. We know what happened in Venezuela, but the oil was a clear asset there for the Americans that were behind this line. A little bit to say is what is coming. I think, from what I read, is a real regime change probably is still on a plate. They already say by the end of the year. I don't think a military intervention is something that is going to happen as strong as as can happen as a Venezuelan style. I think they prefer to continue with economical pressure that has been more effective on Cuba. But the big question here is what are really the U.S. government's trying to achieve in Cuba? What are the benefits for the U.S. just making with this regime change and all these changes that now apparently Díaz-Canel is trying to put in line with the transformation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a critical question, because actually a lot of the things that the Cubans have said that they can do are not actually possible with the US legislation and listing of Cuba as a state-sponsored terrorism and so on at the moment. They won't be able to do a lot of the things that they say they want to do. So, yeah, it does all depend on the US. It depends on the US, I think, more than it depends even on Cuba now. Yes, what do the US want? I'm the specialist on Cuba rather than the US, but it seems to me what they want is two things. They want the Cuban economy to be opened up to them, and they want regime change. Marco Rubio is more committed to regime change, and I think, to simplify it, I think Donald Trump could be more persuaded by the economic possibilities of Cuba. So there you have an issue. Regime change would be, whichever way you do it, will be not easy. They've already been surprised that Cuba's lasted so long. without people overthrowing their government or the government surrendering or some kind of regime change, or some kind of commitment towards, changing their political system. I mean, that's been, that's not actually what had been hoped for on the US side. And so Cuba's system, the resilience of the Cuban system has been a bit of a setback for the US, I believe, and maybe has precipitated some kind of rethink, but I don't know. Maybe you people who follow the US more closely than I do would be able to shed light on that. But it seems to me that, as you say, I agree with you, the military option seems to have been kind of slightly shifted off the table. There was a build-up and a lot of very belligerent words. And now even Marco Rubio is talking about, we have to negotiate. He still wants regime change, but there's no way to do regime change without a heavy cost, one way or the other, seems to me, and a lot of risk. So I'll leave it to you. I'll be able to answer that question.
Could I just, before trying to answer such a difficult question, I just wanted to ask you one thing about resilience. Looking from the outside, there are reasons to believe there'd be a lot more protests than there's actually been, because you have half the country without electricity on a rotating basis. You have very, very high unemployment, queues for everything, and it's very hard to live in Cuba today. And we know that, more than 20% of the population has actually left. It's an aging population. You might say in other societies there would have been a lot more protests than there has actually been. How come it's so resilient?
That's also a big question, but I would say that sometimes the way that Cuba has been described or conceived outside Cuba fails to take on board the extent to which, one, the Cubans feel dependent on the state during crisis, because it's a state that's providing minimal food supplies, but it's keeping the education system. The doctors are still there, some of them, a lot of them have left. And so actually dependence on the state has increased. The government's reaction has been very much one of, we need to protect the vulnerable and so on. It's barely able to do that. But so there's that side of it, as well as the side, people in the US, when I talk to them, they say it's because there's such repression and, they can't squeak without somebody coming down on them or arresting them. I don't think that's the case. I think, so there's not so much protest. There's a whole lot of people, and I do academic collaboration, and so I work with people who work in the universities, which is not completely representative. But what I see is people who are continuing to work, continue with projects. Municipal representatives are continuing to try to identify the most vulnerable people in their areas in order to get food to them. So there's a kind of a sense of dealing with it. I would say that there's also a sense of complete exhaustion. People are exhausted, physically exhausted, queuing, getting up in the middle of the night to use the electricity when it comes on, walking everywhere because there's no transport. What I feel is that people are very exhausted, and maybe that's actually why, muted protest, because people are just too tired, which is a different thing from other countries. This kind of cutting off of the electricity and transport and so on, it's very difficult to do anything. So I think that that's actually also an element.
I wanted to ask if Julian wants to put a question about entrepreneurship in Cuba, or about the way companies may or may not invest, because I noticed that quite a significant number have left recently, including, is it Sherritt, the Canadian multinational, and a number of hotel chains, including Meliá from Spain.
Is that a question for Julian?
It is a question for Julian, but he may be on mute. Julian, can you hear us?
Yeah, no, I can hear you. I don't know if it's a question for me. It's more of a question for Emily.
Well, I'm happy with either or both of you answering.
Well, first one, yes, I mean, what the US has done is frighten foreign businesses, and there probably will be more withdrawing. And both of those things are a huge blow to the Cuban economy. And they, whether Meliá is kind of keeping its options open for later. Sherritt seems to have been approached by somebody who wants to take over their share. But there's entrepreneurship when it comes from the foreign investors. Certainly, there's a lot of discouragement there from fear of US sanctions. In terms of domestically, a lot of the young entrepreneurs have left, but there's still, and in fact, as the state salaries are so low, people are still looking for business ideas and they're still registering businesses. And if you actually go to the areas of Havana where people have money from one source or another, from doing business or from friends abroad or from black market activity, there's a lot of private sector activity. In fact, the retail sector is probably richer and, more well-developed than it's ever been, partly because the state can't provide anything. But so there's a kind of a really interesting development in pockets. There's an increase in inequality, clearly, that everybody knows about. But some people are not living badly, and there's a whole consumer market developing there and services. And that, as I said, people who are applying to set up their own businesses, there's a rapid acceleration in approvals. So the intention, and I think it's likely to actually happen, is that domestic savings will now be brought in to investment, which it hasn't happened before. They're talking about developing a financial system, and the financial institutions can be private. I mean, that took me aback. So you're not just state banks. Foreign investors can go in there and set up a private bank, financial institution. And so, that will animate the economy in the part of it which was most problematic previously, the part of it which was really not moving, the complete absence of any kind of model of accumulation. It's going to be quite a process because a lot of people don't understand how business works at all. There's a hell of a lot of learning got to happen. But those people who are in private business, I mean, I know of a few, setting up consultancies to help other businesses, teaching them how to do accounts, how to do their tax returns, how to do their investment plans, and their business plans for the future. All of that is going on. There's a whole ecosystem which is emerging now. Again, under-acknowledged from the outside, but it does exist, and it's got potential to kind of fill a space. I mean, it's a complete vacuum at the moment where kind of entrepreneurship needs to be. So I think it's really one to watch.
Yeah. And
sorry, Andrew, I keep interrupt you.
Your interruptions are totally welcome.
Thank you. No, it's really interesting what you're saying about this, trying to move the probably small business inside Cuba and all the savings that the local population. But that jumps also me an idea. Again, playing a little bit, if this move in the way that we're saying, because there's still a lot to see if this is going to happen or not. But what role can play now the diaspora? There is a huge diaspora in Miami, obviously, but all around. And I'm pretty sure they are interested to well, at least invest or do some kind of business inside Cuba as well.
Yeah, they're specifically referred to in the document. They keep saying Cubans in Cuba and Cubans outside Cuba and foreigners. They're listed separately. But very often when they refer to Cubans in Cuba and Cubans outside Cuba, they keep saying that. So this is a pitch for the Cuban Americans. So the Cuban Americans, some of them know what's in Cuba. There are properties, there are factories lying empty, there are hotels which are underused. All of that. There is a lot of real estate, and the real estate laws have been changed to allow more investment in that area. So, people say, what's Cuba got to offer? Because Venezuela's got oil. What's Cuba got? I think real estate, the land itself officially still belongs to the state. They will keep insisting. But if you can lease off the land on 100-year leases, it's as close to privatization as you can get. And they're talking about, setting up mortgage finance, share finance, businesses, and so on. So what they're talking about is something deliberately, I think, to attract the attention of Cuban Americans. And in that way, I suppose they're hoping that they might split the community into those who would never go to Cuba unless there's regime change, and those who would take the business opportunity that might be there. Of course, there's a huge risk because, what's been the deterrent all these years has actually been the risk that US legislation, US sanctions might, even if they're opened up, even if you get a license, the government might change its mind in the US and turn around and start to prosecute. And that's what happened to Airbnb, happened to cruise companies, is that they thought they had a license under the Obama administration, and now they're being prosecuted. So you can imagine, what business is going to invest under those circumstances. But if you've got close family there, and you want to work with them on building a business, it seems like it's something that you'd be watching.
I had a question also about risk. I understand what you're saying about perhaps an entrepreneurial opportunity in Cuba, but can you make it work when you don't have electric power half of the day and you can't plan ahead? Is there that kind of gap between where they'd like to be and where they actually are? Is that surmountable?
Well, it's not just electric power, it's the infrastructure generally in a terrible state, but electric power certainly. I think the answer to that question is, watch what's happening with the import of solar power systems. There's such a huge surge. I don't know if you've seen the figures of the imports from, not only from China, even from the US. People are sending over panels and batteries, power systems to keep businesses going, to keep households going, but to keep businesses going as well. So, it's a very interesting moment. So that this year they were planning to have 15% of their total electricity from renewables. It looks like that's going to be exceeded because of the input of, additional humanitarian assistance, which has brought a whole lot more as well, but also the private sector. You can buy your photovoltaic system, and which is already imported. You can buy it and you can get somebody to fix it and your business can still run. So, yes, the railway needs rebuilding. The roads, a lot of roads are in terrible state. And the electricity infrastructure, the network itself needs a large amount of investment. So we'll see. The government is going to maintain control of what they call strategic industries, which I imagine will be the electricity sector. But they look like they're inviting foreign investors, to take on contracts for some of that work. And what's happened is I did a seminar in Cuba a couple of years ago on ending fossil fuel subsidies. They had almost the cheapest fuel for cars in the world, if you translated it into dollars. It was ridiculous. So for anybody who had dollars, there's absolutely no incentive to economize on your electricity or on your petrol. Suddenly, the sales in Cuban pesos have disappeared because of the US blockade on oil. They've disappeared, and so all purchases of petrol or gasoline, what the US calls it, and diesel have to be at world market prices. So they've ended fossil fuel subsidies, which in many countries causes riots and revolutions and military coups. They've ended it de facto. And so the question is, if they do get a restoration of oil deliveries, will they go back to that previous system? I don't think so. They can make it a little bit cheaper than it is now, but the subsidy is gone. Now that the subsidy is gone, if the oil comes back and if electricity adjustments are made, and they said that they're going to withdraw subsidies from households, then the electricity company will have money to contract out its services. So that's several stages, because they can't increase the price of domestic electricity at the moment because they haven't adjusted wages. So there's a price wage adjustment that needs to happen in order for state subsidies for consumers to disappear. But the state subsidies for businesses is disappearing, and the businesses will shut. And I think you pointed out something very important, which is there will be people laid off. There'll be people who are out of work involuntarily. That figure is very low, and you think, why is it so low? And that's because people don't declare themselves willing and able to work. That's what you have to do in order to be registered on the unemployment register, because they just go into the private sector. If you say you're willing to work, then you have to get a state job, and they pay so low that nobody wants to register. But so the number of people without formal employment will increase. So what the government has done, as one of the little items hidden away there, is that they've introduced minimum wages for people retraining. So if you do retraining, and the retraining places will be made available by the enterprises apparently, then you get a minimum wage, and with the minimum wage also goes entitlements to childcare and pensions and other things that you get from being a waged worker. So they're anticipating, I think, a shedding of labour from the state sector. They've actually stated that state administration will shed, I think it's 10% of their workers compared to the end of 2025. They've already lost, I'd imagine, a third of their workforce, as people moving out anyway. So they're talking about continuing process of rationalisation of the state administration and of state enterprises. So, as you say, Andrew, how quick can they do this? It's a massive, and so you will see a brake put on some of the processes. Some companies which they've said they'll close down, won't close down. The process of making redundancies will hit against the trade unions within those entities. So, a difficult process of adjustment from the point of view of employment and wages. They're finally talking about indexing wages and social security, which hasn't been done in the last few years, which is, we've seen a huge reduction in the real value of wages and social assistance. So then that will bring up the whole question of how their official inflation index is flattered by the weighting of goods and services within it. But that's another issue that they've got to tackle.
How much?
This and go ahead, Andrew, please.
Yeah. How much of this is if you like, in public debate? How much is acknowledged? What are the politics of it inside Cuba? You mentioned that Raúl Castro had blessed the changes, but are there different groups arguing different hypotheses?
Well, certainly the ones that I'm closest to are the economists, and generally among the economists, they're liberalisers, as you can imagine. For years, they've bemoaned the fact that they're kind of nobody's listening to them. They seem to have been brought in the current discussions. The debates in the National Assembly seem to have resulted in a whole host of amendments. There's also been discussions in the trade union. There's debates, and there will certainly be people who say, what's this got to do with the Marxism that I understood that we had? And there's a lot of the way that it's presented. This is a question of survival, and survival is the most important thing. So, when they say that, you think, to what extent will they roll back? But given that these things, in my view, have been on the cards, they've been buried in previous versions of their reforms using different vocabulary. And I think this is, to a large extent, to a large extent, a continuation of that process of accepting. I mean, essentially, when they lost the Soviet bloc, they had to reinsert the economy into the global market. What they did is a series of enclaves, tourism, nickel, medical services, and so on. Just, some small bits of the economy, which were still state-controlled or very tightly managed, which didn't have sufficient multiplier effects throughout the rest of the economy. But over the last 10 years, there's been, a definite move towards the expansion of the private sector. And even in the, worst time of COVID, the middle of COVID, the time when, they just had the demonstrations, riots, whatever you call them, in July 2021. In August 2021, they approved the creation of small businesses, which was a big move because previously you were just self-employed. People were employing other people kind of informally. But then suddenly, businesses have been set up. Then there were a maximum of 100 people. Now the limit has been taken off. So you're talking about a real shift, but a shift that started quite a while ago, but it's accelerated now. If the speed of acceleration will depend on the US.
Clearly, the US is probably the main player here that is moving all the lines. But, and probably this is a question not only for you, Emily, but also for Julian and Andrew, because I'm thinking more in geopolitical terms in that area. But what role can play Europe in that area? And what can expect, for example, the current Cuban government to try to reach some kind of attraction from European investment? And can Europe do that? Will the Americans allow something like that to some kind of competition? Or just like Trump has been saying, this is American turf, so everything's going to be American and it's our game, basically.
Julian, I'm going to let you start.
No, sorry, so I'm going to verge to different thoughts, but it's been really interesting. I mean, I don't know if you mentioned it, but the economy of Cuba is actually pretty big. It's fairly small population, but the GDP per capita is pretty strong versus the rest of the world, or Latin American world. And I think we forget about that to some extent. When I look at some macro data for Cuba itself, it doesn't feel like a country in huge danger, again, relative to other Latin American countries or other parts of the world. And when I hear about all the moves that the US is making at the moment, it's been going on for a long time, these restrictions and so on. And again, I'm just questioning to some extent to what extent the current government or the current party in charge in Cuba is going to move in any way towards the Americans. I take an example, which I'm going back to the geopolitics, Alberto, was that many years ago, if you remember, I had a factory, an ice cream factory in China, and we were trying to sell selling in China, and at some stage I was approached to sell to Cuba. And selling ice cream to Cuba meant dealing at the highest level for the entire country, effectively to be allowed to export the ice cream that we were producing. And so it was supposed to be a country level agreement that would be done on it's a long time ago, but maybe it was delivery of a quarterly basis of a huge amount of ice cream, which of course was not possible because my factory was very small. And then the payment terms were just not agreeable to what I could do as a small business. But I just remember that there were very few countries where this happened. And so you had Cuba, one level, and then you had North Korea in the same vein of dealing at the top level and for countrywide distribution of the product. And the only reason that we, I presume, asked about this was simply because we were state China, which once enabled some of these discussions to start. And then going back to it, so that means that presumably you still have very strong Chinese presence in Cuba, I would assume. Maybe perhaps to some extent replacing what the Russian had. And then I go back to the point I was making, which, that's so in comparison terms, so I compared to, let's say, Bolivia, which is a 40 billion GDP economy, more or less, give or take, about 11 to 12 million people, versus Cuba, which is 100 billion plus, and about the same amount of people living in a country which is presumably smaller than Bolivia, actually having within, but much closer to the US. And the differences for me is huge, but it also means it also talks to the depth potentially of the economy or the potential of Cuba itself. To what extent, how come they were able to, despite all the restrictions and and everything, to have such a large economy altogether? And when you look at some of the data, which is cannot be trusted to some extent, of course, but if we talk about GDP per capita around $10,000, some estimates actually are double that. There are some sources that mention actually the GDP per capita is closer to 20,000, which in itself is a bit strange, because of all the things that we hear, but at the same time we understand, the export of medics to other countries was big. Was mentioned throughout the entire Latin America. You would hear from pretty much every country that the Cuban were exporting the medics to every country possible. So, there's a lot of grey zone areas that come to mind when I think about Cuba in itself. I do not understand these numbers that I mentioned, the stats. I don't understand also why is there so much pressure today compared to some other times where you had, literally some economic, in terms of GDP, collapsed. 1993 was a big fall in GDP, for instance, closer to night. Also now, of course, during the COVID years and so on. So yes, you can have an accumulation through time of, on all these and these problems. But actually, even today, when we look at some of the forecasts of GDP growth, it's still higher than the UK or European countries. And so this this idea that suddenly the country collapses something doesn't sit right here. And then I go back to the 2 points that you, I think, making at some stage when I was listening to Julian, which is about the tension of the Trump administration, where you clearly possibly have two current. And we've seen one example of what happens recently with, let's say, Iran or the Iran or even Venezuela, which is one, it's about, for me, on a financial standpoint, is about the capture of value by the US of value being generated by the country, be it natural resources or whatever resources that the country wants to give. And then that's completely independent of who's in power. We've seen it in Venezuela, but by doing this capture, someone replaced it, and the US is quite happy to make deals with that. And Iran, to some extent, a similar idea where you had something happen. There was many. We can talk about. We can spend the entire speaking on Iran again, but similar things. Now you have deals being made. Well, the Iranians, the regime is still there. Maybe it's more, in my humble opinion, it's more potentially to shift the capture value away from China's hold of Iran versus the US, and confront Iran. So you need to deal with the US and think about us before you were just thinking about China. That's the way I perceive the actual movements going on. And then now we have Cuba, which is high in agenda. And of course, you have this entire shifts or reforms that were described, and which are quite significant. When you have 80% of your public sector GDP and more coming from the private sector, and suddenly opening up, and I think you mentioned, banks becoming private and international investors. Significant moves here. And then within the current administration, you have Bolivia, which is probably wants a regime change altogether, versus the more value capture, call it trunk ideas about, well, actually, we don't care who's there as long as they open up the economy and we can do business there. And I think that's really important to keep in mind about how this goes forward.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. The only thing is, I've had a lot of discussion about the size of the Cuban economy. Of course, when they had a 1-to-1 exchange rate, it was valued at such and such. And then when they changed the exchange rate, it's valued at another amount. And I think 10,000 is a bit high, but there is enormous potential. They're a very well-educated population. They have a lot of scientific capacity. And, although the infrastructure is in a ropey state, it's actually quite well developed. They do actually have the roads there, they have the railways there and so on. And they have the telecommunications as well. So, there's a big question about the actual value of the economy. It's 9 million people now, down from 11 million, and maybe even more. And I completely agree. There's lots of grey zones. I remember when there was a discussion years ago about, what would be the effect of the US tightening its sanctions against Cuba. And the obvious thing, is that Cuba will have to move towards China and Russia because it won't have any choice. If you introduce, the state sponsors of terrorism law and Western banks won't touch Cuba, the only way that Cuba can do trade is to move east, to move towards those countries. So that's the kind of, self-harm that the US has done, is by shifting Cuba towards China and Russia. And I remember even before all of that, even I think during the opening, I put it to a Cuban that, he was saying, because I'm English, they say, we'd love to do more business with you, with the British. And I said, well, why not? Because, we do produce something still, And he said, well, it's the terms. It's the terms of, the amount that you charge for short-term credits and so on, because the risk adjustment is so big that it just costs too much to buy anything from the United Kingdom, even then. So, and they said the Chinese are the only ones who offer us reasonable terms. And so even then they were going towards China. That was at least a decade ago. So China's been bitten because Cuba owes China a lot of money. So they kind of cooled off. But nonetheless, they're still doing trade. Well, they're doing very good trade in photovoltaic systems and so on. And they're still giving donations. And, and Cuba, because of that dependency, and the dependency also on Russia, apparently at the time during COVID, when Cuba couldn't get any oxygen from anywhere for people in hospitals, it was Russia that came forward. And the Cuban said to me, we don't forget that, nobody else would sell us the oxygen, but Russia did. So there's a kind of, even though Russia and Cuba have nothing in common in terms of the current political system or even the economic system, really, there is a kind of historical, quite a few Cubans speak Russian from the past. There's a bit of an affinity there at certain levels. And so the question that you asked was, what can Europe do? How can Europe get into this market? And my concern, as, from London, is that the way that if the US does open, if they get a deal for Cuban Americans to buy into Cuban assets on a large scale, if they do it by issuing licenses, on the basis of approvals for each contract, if they do it like that and leave the state sponsors of terrorism legislation in place and leave the Helms-Burton provisions in place, other countries will be locked out. So, and I don't think that that's unlikely, if you see what I mean. I think if there's a deal, that will be the plan. And so far, of course, when Helms-Burton Title III was introduced in 1996, there were quite loud objections from the European Union, from the UK, and from Canada, and they introduced countervailing measures. This time, there's been not a squeak, not any protest, now that, because Title III was suspended until this current Trump administration. And that was those extraterritorial part of it. They would prosecute companies from outside of the United States. So, so you think, well, if Trump were to get a deal that he could sell to his US constituency, and in particular to those Cuban Americans who would be prepared to accept a deal without regime change, without victory as such, then that could be an issue. And it seems to me that he could get away with that quite easily under current circumstances because of the method that is being used now, it seems, from the US side in diplomacy, is to use whatever economic and political pressure they can do to achieve, economic pressure to achieve their political ends. And this is one of their objectives, is to, what's he say? Take Cuba. Well, this is a form of taking Cuba, in a sense. And it would benefit Cuba for sure, because they'd get the finance. But it would also make Cuba shift the dependency to the extent that there is. I mean, the dependency on China isn't anything like what it was on the Soviet Union. But shift the dependency back to the United States, where it was before 1959. So, it's one to watch. I mean, from the point of view of non-US potential investors, it's a very important issue, because at the moment, the deterrent effect of the state sponsors of terrorism is pretty complete. I mean, there's very, very little that gets through that. So, and even in the field that I do, which is academic collaboration, even that is very difficult with all of the US measures that have been taken. Academics don't want to go and do research collaboration with Cuba because they won't be able to get an ESTA visa waiver. And for academics, going to US conferences is important. The universities, when they look at the funding bid, they go through the compliance process, which means contacting their bank and saying, is this okay? Are there any compliance issues? And the bank has red flagged Cuba because it's got sanctions against it. So the bank will just simply say, no, we can't do that. We can't process any payments that go to Cuba. So, that's academic collaboration, which actually is easier from the United States than it is from the UK because of those issues. In the US, you can get a license. In the UK, you're outside of the licensing remit. Although I do understand that one could apply for a US Treasury Department license, but, that's very difficult for a small entity. It's very risky. It has to be renewed every 2 years. So it's the level of risk is the prohibitive thing. We call it overcompliance, and overcompliance is complete. So it would be interesting to see.
I think just to cut to the chase there, do you see a regime change happening?
Well, I think maybe before you came, the regime change is extremely risky. There's no such thing as peaceful regime change in the case of Cuba. So you remove a few top people, it wouldn't really make any difference because it's very institutionalized. It's not about individuals. So how do you achieve that? You force them to surrender explicitly. Surrender? Well, first of all, it's very unlikely. And secondly, there would be quite a lot of people who would object very strongly to that in Cuba.
So just thinking through this, and as you were asking about Trump and the US, it seems that for the midterms, in any case, it's not something that will be happening. It's just the opening up of the economy is already a big one.
Yeah, I was talking to a US journalist, and they talked about the best case scenario where, there's a surrender, and then there's, democracy, a multi-party democracy, and then there's capitalism, and that's the best case scenario. And I'm thinking, does anybody think that's a possibility? But it does seem that in the US, that's how the conversation is going. And that's the intractable problem, is that what the US thinks it's entitled to do and what is possible to achieve doesn't match what the Cuban side would ever do. And so then you're talking about a conflict situation. And, I don't think the US really wants civil war in Cuba because of the migration issue.
Exactly. You just mentioned that. I was thinking in this at this moment. Migration is one of the main worries, not just in the US, but in general for Latin America. I was just reading that Uruguay, for example, has received a big flood of Cuban migration recently. And this is because of the crisis that Cuba is receiving. But this happened as well in Central America, the countries. So it could be a problem not just for the US, but for the rest of Latin America in that way. And on the other side, one thing that I'm thinking loud on this is a regime change that probably Marco Rubio is what they want, and the more hawkish elements in the US government is trying to do is complicated, but also expensive in a way, very expensive. And I think the most pragmatic element of the US, and apparently that's a little bit the line of strategy that I haven't seen, is economic pressure is much cheaper. And in a way, I think they have forced at the moment to the current Cuban government a transition period. And maybe that's what we're going to see. I think we have to wait until the end of the year what is going to happen, because that's the deadline that the US government has put to the Cuban government to go. But a regime change could be very difficult. And I think, you can correct me, I think the migratory crisis is going to get worse unless they're trying to find some kind of transition around that from Cuba.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of, can I just add a couple of things?
Of course.
Yeah, migration is very important, but also security. This is a weird one. Security services in Cuba and the United States have been working closely together for a very long time. So, against migration, but also against drug trafficking, against money laundering. Cuba is actually a very strong partner for the US security services, which is something that neither side talk about. But this is, Cuba is the country within the region which the US has to worry least about in terms of drug trafficking and terrorism. I mean, it's not a risk because the Cuban security services, they work very closely. They extradite people. Criminals who come over to Cuba are extradited to the United States. So I think that's an interesting one because it's something which neither side really talks about. I think that expression that used, economic pressure is cheaper. Yeah, it's cheap for the United States to continue to not lift the sanctions that they've got. And I think this question about how expensive regime change would be is an interesting one, because you could imagine you could win over the Cuban population if there was a huge amount of public money from the United States going to rebuild the entire infrastructure. But that's not going to happen. I mean, really, very expensive. It wouldn't just be private investment that they'd need. They'd need development assistance. They'd need agreements on the compensation for nationalization as well. But in order to pay for that, Cubans can't pay. So, there would have to be some kind of concessionary finance or, bailing out the Cubans. And then the other thing to remember is that Diaz-Canel, the president of Cuba, is stepping down in 2028. He has 2 terms maximum. So I think that there's an interesting thing here. He could say, okay, you want political change? There will be political change in 2028. And then maybe package it as some kind of, reform. Maybe they change the system for appointing the president. They could do something like that quietly, because it's quite possible he's appointed like the prime minister in this country by a vote in parliament, but it's never been contested. in theory, it could be contested. So you could have a contested presidency, or you could even develop a system for direct elections for the presidency, because there's a separation now between the president and the prime minister. So, you could have, and the prime minister is a different person from the president, who is, again, you could have a separation between the president and the head of the Communist Party, which it happened for a short time in the interim between the shift between presidents. So Raúl stepped down from the presidency, but not from the Communist Party. So the head of the state was not the head of the Communist Party. So there's a precedent for that. Can happen. So there are things you can do within the Constitution, I suppose. But again, nobody seems to be aware in the United States that the president has a maximum of 2 terms. They call it, they actually call it they think that the Castros are always in charge. There's a weird obsession with the Castros. I mean, it's not weird because Castros were in power a long time, but the fact that they were negotiating with a not very high-standing grandson, whose second surname is Castro, was, this is what the Cubans had to do to convince the US, or what the US had to have as a kind of trophy Castro to negotiate with. That's not actually how the system works. It's not a system where power is passed down through members of the family. So I think, there's a lot of kind of awareness building in the US. And I think that if the negotiations are going on and they're very secret, it must be a learning process for the US to to understand the reality of Cuba is quite different from the myth that they've created. Anyway, so
this has been a fascinating discussion, but I'm conscious we've pretty much run out of time. So I wonder.
See the time. I've got another meeting at 5.
Oh right, we better be super fast then. Yeah. I don't know if anyone wants to have short final comment in 60 seconds, and then we'll close it down with thanks to Emily.
Well, I would. Yeah. No, sorry, Emily. No, I don't know. I keep interrupting today. Everybody apologize for that.
Me too.
Just as Andrew says, that has been a fascinating conversation today, and I'm really pleased from all what I learned today about Cuba. But one of the things for me that comes as an ending is probably the big question is, after the announcement of these reforms, how deep is going to be this transition in theory that is going the Cuban government or not? And this is the big question. Are we really at the end of one chapter and going to another? Cuba is not anymore the country it was in the past. We were talking before, there is this romanticism about Cuba, but the fact is that the influence of the island in the region is not as strong as it was. But there are elements that could be really interesting from an economic perspective. So the big question says, let's wait until the end of the year to see where is going Cuba heading, actually. At this moment, the question is transition or what is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the next few months will be really telling. And I think well done for kind of convening this discussion, because I think it's one to watch, definitely. Yeah.
Emily,
okay.
Thank you very much. We seem to have lost Julian temporarily, but thank you so much for spending so much time with us. And I won't delay you any longer.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to have to make my apologies. Okay, well, thank you very much. Lovely to meet you. If you've got more questions, just send them along. Okay.
A pleasure. Thank you. Bye.